In a quiet middle-class neighborhood, where the houses were surrounded by well-kept gardens and the air smelled of fresh flowers, lived Valeria, a 32-year-old woman who was known for her bright smile and contagious energy. Valeria was married to Antonio, a hard-working and dedicated 34-year-old man who worked as an engineer at a local firm. The couple seemed to be living a dream life. They both enjoyed each other's company and their small group of friends. However, Valeria's life was about to take an unexpected turn. In this same neighborhood, there was a tennis teacher named Julian. At 35 years old, Julian was a charismatic figure. Tall and athletic, he always wore a smile on his face, attracting everyone's attention with his friendly way of speaking. He was known for being patient and passionate about his work. Many saw him as a mentor, especially the children who took lessons with him. A distinctive characteristic of Julian was his love of food. Every week, he would go to Valeria and Antonio's house for lunch, where he would share laughter, anecdotes, and often advice about tennis and life. The relationship between Valeria and Julian had begun years before, when she decided to learn to play tennis. From there, the friendship between the two blossomed, becoming a bond that would transcend the merely sporting. Julian, due to his closeness to the couple, became part of family gatherings, and Valeria considered him a very close friend. They would sit together in the patio, enjoying long talks during Sunday lunches, sharing anecdotes about their childhood, their dreams and desires. Valeria admires Julian for his dedication, his commitment to sport and his ability to make those around him smile. However, within this apparent harmony, deeper feelings were hidden. Both felt an attraction that, at first, was subtle, but quickly grew in intensity. Valeria began to notice, in her heart, flashes of a love she had never imagined, a desire that challenged loyalty to her husband. Despite their friendship and closeness, these feelings filled her with guilt, although the tension and chemistry between them became increasingly difficult to ignore. On the other hand, Julian's world was also entangled in secrets. His wife, Elena, a beautiful and ambitious woman, worked as an architect at a prestigious firm. Elena was very focused on her career, which often kept her away from home. Her relationship with Julian was noticeable in public, but behind closed doors, they struggled to find a balance between their careers and their personal lives. Julian, feeling lonely at times, found company in meetings with Valeria and Antonio, unaware that their interactions were becoming dangerously intimate. The weeks went by, and the friendly relationship slowly morphed into something more complicated. On one occasion, Julian helped Valeria with her serving technique at a local tennis club on a Saturday afternoon. What started as a simple practice turned into a tense moment. The warmth of the sun, the ragged breath, and the accidental brush of their hands as they exchanged rackets caused sparks to fly between them. They looked into each other's eyes, and Valeria felt a torrent of emotions that she barely knew how to handle. That afternoon marked the beginning of a relationship that would challenge her and Julian's everyday lives. Returning home, Valeria felt caught in a whirlwind of emotions. When Antonio cheerfully asked her about her day, she forced a smile, unable to share the truth. The meetings continued, and the tennis teacher and Valeria began to share longer glances, knowing laughs, and moments that made their hearts beat faster. One spring afternoon, while they were having lunch together, the conversation became more personal. Valeria confessed some concerns about her life, her marriage, and the expectations she felt for her future. Julian, attentive, listened to her with interest. It was in that conversation that they both crossed the fine line between the platonic and the emotional. Julian, feeling that their bonds were becoming unbreakable, began to dream of a future he could not have. For him, Valeria represented everything he longed for, a life full of love, joy, and passion. However, that illusion was also his downfall, a forbidden love that could not come to be. Little by little, the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The friendly relationship turned into a hidden romance. They sent messages to each other, they met at unpredictable moments, and, although they tried to keep up appearances, the attraction was about to overflow. On one key occasion, after lunch at Valeria's house, where Antonio had gone to work, Julian and Valeria were left alone together in the patio. Between laughs and glances, the tension accumulated in the air exploded in a kiss that would seal their destiny. That kiss was a point of no return. It was impossible for them to stop seeing each other. They began to meet in a small apartment that Julian had, where they felt free to play at being a couple. The emotions were intense, but they hid an enormous risk that neither of them could ignore. Meanwhile, Elena, Julian's wife, had already noticed some changes in his behavior. Julian used to be more talkative, more restless, and his lack of attention to small things did not go unnoticed. However, so far, she had no concrete evidence to suspect that her husband was involved in anything more than an increase in work. Julian had become a master of lies, and the warmth of his relationship with Valeria made him feel alive, despite the danger that lurked every time they met. The days continued, filled with passion and desire, and each encounter seemed to take them further from the path they had trod. However, what began as a harmless love would soon turn into a tragedy that would mark their lives forever. Part 2. The Hidden Love and Revelation. With each encounter, Valeria and Julian became more immersed in the torrent of emotions that arose from their secret relationship. The afternoons in Julian's small apartment became a refuge where they could forget about the outside world and the responsibilities they carried on their shoulders. Laughter and caresses were constant. Both found themselves in images of a love that they knew could not last, but that they still could not resist. The clandestine encounters became more and more frequent, and the adrenaline involved in the stolen moments only fueled their desire. They talked about their lives, their frustrations and hopes, filling themselves with the illusion of a deep connection that, until then, had been denied to them. However, in Valeria's mind, a persistent voice whispered that something had to change. The secret life she led filled her with guilt and anxiety. Valeria often took stock of her emotions during those days. Mornings filled with hope upon waking turned into afternoons shrouded in confusion and fear. The image of Antonio, always present in her mind, with his kind way of addressing her, caused her to go into turmoil. She found herself in a situation where she wanted to be happy with Julian, but the weight of betrayal tormented her. However, everything changed one dark February evening. Valeria had had a particularly rough day, and when she arrived at Antonio's house, he greeted her with a warm smile. She skillfully hid her emotions as they sat down to dinner, but he, as always, could tell she wasn't herself. "Is something wrong, honey?" Antonio asked. "No, I'm fine," she replied in an attempt to steer the conversation in a lighter direction. But deep down, Valeria knew that the secret couldn't stay hidden forever. The relationship between Julian and Valeria continued to grow in intensity, and the next step was inevitable. After weeks of romantic encounters, the decision to escalate their relationship came unexpectedly. On one of their dates, while sharing a bottle of wine in Julian's apartment, he looked into her eyes with a depth that made her take her breath away. "Valeria, I can't go on like this. I want you and I want more of this. I want us to be together, without secrets," he confessed. Valeria felt a mix of excitement and fear. "But Julian, my husband—" "I don't know, this isn't right," she argued, her voice shaking. He took her hand, staring at her. "I know, but it's real what we feel. Don't you feel it too?" The tension was palpable, and Valeria's response hung in the air, as they both understood the magnitude of what they were facing. Days later, in an attempt to escape the distressing memories of their everyday lives, Valeria and Julian decided to spend a weekend at the beach, a place where they could live their love without prejudice. This trip became a dream come true for Valeria. Walks on the shore, candlelit dinners and stolen moments in the sensation of the ocean. But happiness was short-lived. In a moment of intimacy, when Julian leaned in to kiss her gently, an image of Antonio flashed through Valeria's mind. A wave of guilt came so intense that it made her abruptly pull away. "Julian, this isn't right," she said, fighting back tears. After that weekend, Valeria decided it was time to take a step back. She felt trapped in a dangerously charged love triangle and knew it was only a matter of time before someone in her life started to get suspicious. However, Julian wasn't about to let her go that easily. He began sending her increasingly passionate messages, making the distance between them feel even more unbearable. Despite her decision to end it all, she couldn't resist the attraction. In her mind there was a constant tug-of-war between what her heart desired and what her conscience told her. One afternoon, as Valeria was getting ready to go out with a friend, she received a call from Julian. "Can we meet? Today is an important day and I need to talk to you," he said in a serious voice. The warning in his tone made her uneasy, but her curiosity was stronger. Valeria found herself deciding to run towards danger. The easiest thing would be to face the truth. They met at the cafe they usually visited, a cozy place, full of foreigners and locals alike. Julian waited at a table in the back, his expression grim. "Valeria, my wife has started to get suspicious," he confessed, his voice a whisper. A chill ran down Valeria's spine. Fear and guilt intertwined. "How is this possible?" "What did you say to her?" he asked, feeling like he was losing control. "She found some text messages. I know it smells fishy. She asked me if there's something I need to confess," Julian said, his gaze pleading. Valeria gasped. Reality hit them with the force of a moving train. In the weeks that followed, paranoia took hold of both of them, especially Valeria. Every day, their relationship became a dangerous game of hiding. The furtive glances between them were filled with deep love, but also fear. Valeria tried to keep things under control, but she couldn't help but feel that the situation was becoming unsustainable. The casual outings and hasty encounters became even more risky. One night, after dinner with Antonio, Valeria felt emotionally drained. Antonio was more affectionate than usual, which accentuated the guilt Valeria felt towards Julian. "You look a little tired, are you okay?" he asked her with that concern that used to make her heart break a little more each time. "Yeah, I just had a long day," she replied, avoiding any hint that could lead Antonio to suspicion. However, the storm was gathering. It wasn't long before Julian's wife Elena confronted her husband. One day, under the pressure of the built-up tension, she found a message on Julian's phone, an intimate message he had sent to Valeria. Elena, crazed and hurt, decided to confront him. "Who is Valeria? Why are you lying to me? What is happening?" she asks indignantly, her eyes burning with a mixture of sadness and rage. When confronted, Julian was left in shock, the words refusing to leave his mouth. Elena, feeling like her entire world was crumbling beneath her feet, demanded answers. "I've tried to be understanding, but this is too much, Julian," she said between sobs. "Do you think I'm stupid? I've been in the dark while you play with someone else's heart," she continued, her voice shaking with indignation. That night, Julian realized that his actions had crossed a line of no return, and the chaos he had created in 2 lifetimes was quickly approaching unbridled rage. Days later, as Valeria tried to maintain normality after the revelation, her worst fears began to come true. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, as she walked through the park, Elena's face appeared before her, full of fury. With a tone full of hatred, Elena faced her. "It's you, the reason for all this pain. Can't you see what you've done?" Valeria, stunned, tried to defend herself. "No, it's not like that. I never wanted to hurt you," she replied, but her words were lost in the air. The encounter marked a point of no return. Elena, consumed by jealousy, explored her form of revenge. It was then that Antonio's anger erupted like a storm. The situation that seemed far away had finally arrived. Antonio, upon learning of his wife's infidelity, felt betrayed and hurt. What began as a hidden love and a game of desire soon turned into something much darker in Antonio's mind. The story of his life changed completely as he plunged into confusion and banal days. However, anger had a face, and that face was about to make its appearance. The days that followed Elena and Valeria's explosive encounter were marked by tension and uncertainty. Everyday life became a scenario of fear and mistrust. Valeria tried to keep her relationship with Julian a secret, but the weight of guilt began to affect her emotional well-being. Each encounter with Julian became more and more distressing, as she knew that the secret they shared could destroy everything. Meanwhile, Antonio, growing increasingly distant and distrustful, decided to investigate further. One day, checking Valeria's phone, he found messages between her and Julian. His heart sank, each word a reminder of the betrayal he was suffering. His self-discipline turned to paranoia, leading him to a heartbreaking encounter with his wife. "What's going on between you and Julian?" he asked her, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Valeria, who had been suffering inside, tried to divert attention. "There is nothing, Antonio. It's just assumptions," she lied, feeling all the emotion of love evaporate. But Antonio didn't believe her. The tension was becoming more and more unbearable. The anguish of having to hide her feelings also took a heavy toll on her. Days later, in a moment of frustration and unable to contain her emotions any longer, Valeria decided she could no longer continue in this destructive cycle. She met with Julian at a small cafe in hopes of discussing what was at stake. "I can't go on like this. Antonio is starting to get suspicious, and this is no longer just a game," she told him, her eyes filled with tears. "But what I feel for you is real," Julian replied. "We can find a way to fix this." However, a feeling of helplessness filled the air between them. Valeria felt like they were trying to build castles in the air, where the wind could knock them over at any moment. Meanwhile, Antonio, feeling increasingly cornered, began planning a confrontation with Julian. Sadness turned to anger, a fuel that drove him to the edge. It wouldn't be long before their paths crossed again. The guilt and pain he felt over his wife's betrayal was consuming him. One day, Antonio decided to confront Julian directly. He found his address through mutual friends and headed to his apartment with a mixture of rage and determination. When he arrived, Julian was unprepared, sitting with a smile that faded when he saw Antonio's menacing gaze. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice nervous. Antonio did not respond. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, he threw a punch at Julian, who recoiled in shock. The fight escalated, hurtful words turned into blows, and the two men became absorbed in the pain and rage they carried within. However, the confrontation went beyond a simple altercation. Antonio's anger transformed into a desperate act. In a moment of madness, he pulled out a knife he had hidden. The air stopped, and what began as an exchange of blows became irreversible. Julian fell to the ground, horror in his eyes as life faded away. Antonio, stunned by what he had done, stepped back. The reality of his action hit him hard. There was no coming back from this. He had crossed a line that could never be erased. His heart still beating, but filled with terror, Antonio fled, leaving Julian lying on the ground. The next few days were chaos for Valeria. When she received the news of Julian's death, her world fell apart. Fear and guilt overwhelmed her. Not only had she lost a lover, but the shadow of despair and tragedy loomed over her. How could she have let it all go so far? Adding to his troubles, Antonio also turned to Valeria with increasingly erratic and aggressive behavior. His pain and anger transformed into a need for control, and she became the target of his frustration. With each passing day, things became darker. "You provoked him. You are guilty of everything," he shouted at her one night, while she could only cry and ask him to calm down. Soon, the situation escalated. The shouting turned into pushing, and the words into hitting. Valeria, trapped in a cycle of abuse, didn't know how to escape. Every time she tried to confront him, the violence escalated, leaving her with bruises and physical and emotional scars. One day, after a heated argument where Antonio accused her of being the cause of his suffering, Valeria finally had the courage to say enough. "You can't go on like this, Antonio. This isn't love. You're turning into a monster," she shouted at him. But as the words left her mouth, a flash of anger crossed Antonio's eyes, and his response was brutal. She fell to the ground after a blow that left her staggering. Fear gripped Valeria, but this time she would not let herself go. She decided she had to seek help. She fled the house and, with her heart pounding, called the police and a close friend, who helped her find shelter. Shortly after, Antonio was arrested following an anonymous call. The evidence of his violence did not go unnoticed, and he was taken into custody. In court, Valeria had to face her worst nightmare. The man she once loved was now an abuser. She felt a mixture of relief and sadness at seeing him on trial, but her freedom could not come at the expense of the suffering all this had caused. As the months passed, Valeria slowly recovered, but the scars of her experience would mark her forever. She sought therapy, found support groups, and although the pain was still present, she would find the strength to rebuild her life. No one could bring Julian back to her, and the fact that her relationship with Antonio had ended in abuse and pain left her exhausted. In prison, Antonio reflected on what had happened, but regret came late. Life had wanted to show him that love should not turn into possession and hatred. When he was finally convicted of Julian's murder and the abuse against Valeria, he realized that he had lost everything that really mattered. Valeria's life took a new turn, filled with challenges, but also with new opportunities for healing. She would never forget Julian or the love they shared, but every day she struggled to move forward and find her own voice. She had emerged from the shadows to reclaim her life and her well-being. In this way, the love story became a lesson about the consequences of betrayal, violence, and the struggle for life. Valeria understood that true strength lies not in not falling, but in getting up after each blow, like a new beginning. While Valeria struggled to recover from the aftermath of the tumultuous end of her relationship with Antonio, Elena was also going through a painful and complex process. After the tragic incident with Julian, her life changed drastically. The betrayal and disappointment had left her with an unbearable emptiness, one that led her to question her very existence. At first, Elena felt caught between anger and guilt. She had been so focused on her own feelings of betrayal towards Julian that she hadn't considered how the situation would affect Valeria and everyone involved. The revelation that her husband had been murdered at the hands of Antonio devastated her. The pain of losing Julian was compounded by the pain of being the victim of her own deception. After the news of Julian's death, Elena sought the help of a therapist to deal with her devastation. Therapy helped her process the complexity of her emotions and confront the guilt she felt, not only for what had happened with Julian, but also for her role in the deception that had defined Valeria's relationship with him. She recognized her own mistakes and the way her anger and mistrust had contributed to the tragedy. Elena decided that she needed to find a way to redeem her life. Instead of falling into despair, she began to get involved in community activities, working with organizations that helped victims of abuse and violence. Through her work, she found a greater purpose and began to heal, becoming an advocate for women's rights and a voice for those who could not speak. Over time, Elena sought out Valeria to try to make amends. The first time they met, it was a tense encounter. Valeria, still dealing with her grief, listened to what Elena had to say, even though she found it hard to forgive her. "I'm not here to justify my actions. I just want you to know that I am deeply sorry for what happened," Elena told her, tears in her eyes. The conversation was long and difficult. Valeria, as she navigated her own scars, began to see in Elena a broken woman, another victim in a web of lies and pain. They began to speak honestly about their experiences and shared their struggles. Although there was a chasm between them, little by little, some empathy began to emerge. Valeria understood that Elena, although she had made mistakes, had also faced her own suffering.